All right. How's everybody tonight? So for those that are on telephone, Ken Crow. Oh man. Well, bless your heart. We're glad you're here. Glad you are doing better. Is there anybody else we need to think about? Need to be mindful of? Taking me a long time to get prepared. I feel like a teenage young lady going out to date. Just took me forever. Anyway, all right. Well, we're hopefully, if I don't talk too long, we will finish First Samuel, and we will start a series of lessons next week. I have planned, if unless someone has something different, but we'll have class next week, and the week after that is Thanksgiving, so we'll have devotional. And but anyway, we'll start a new series. We'll see how far we get tonight. I know I'm long-winded. The First Samuel, the 30th chapter. There's a couple of things in here. There's really two or three things that I think are noteworthy and that we want to talk about. We're down to verse 11, but I think it might be. I was trying to figure out this morning exactly how would be the best way to do this. I think it would be best if if you'll indulge me, I'll read the first 10 verses because if I don't, we're going to jump in the middle of a discussion and not understand it. So let's just read the first 10 verses. You can read them with me. It says, Now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there, from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire. Their wives, their sons, their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives, Ahinoam and Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, Please bring the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, Pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. So David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those stayed who were left behind. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Besor. Well, we have this story. We already looked at it a little bit last week. Go back in your mind, if you will. Go back to what we looked at last week at the very beginning of class. And David, remember, had attached himself to, if you will, an enemy of Israel, the Philistines, and yet when it came time to go to war, men would not let David and his men go with them. Some believed, probably as they were correct, that David was a spy. David really wasn't for them, that David was going to compromise their mission. And so David and his men, they traveled this long way. They had left family. They had left belongings back here, as we see. And they had gone, and yet they were not allowed to fight. Hand of God probably in it. Not probably, was. And God spared them. And so as they go back home, they get back, and notice what's happened. Notice that as they get back, they've, as we talked about, they've traveled, they've come to Ziklag, which is 80 miles from where they were. They've done it on the third day. And most normal travel, biblical travel, a day equals about 20 miles. And so you think in the third day, they ought to maybe 60, but with that many men, probably not even that far, but they've traveled 80, so they are tired. They're very tired. They're weary. And as they get home or as they get back, guess what? Their folks have been taken captive. No one's killed. Folks have been taken captive. And all of their things, or what little things they had, they're gone. And so, as you might guess, in verse 6, David was greatly distressed. And one of the great reasons he was distressed was not only his loss. That was probably first on his mind. He's lost his 2 wives. He's lost his belongings. He's also, if you will, losing his men. David is distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him. One of the great things that we don't talk about, but is kind of evident here, is the leadership of David. Because he's basically going to keep them all together. If you've read recently and recall all this, or maybe you've read it in the past, recall all this, but David pretty much keeps the men together. Most, especially in that time, most would turn and let's get rid of him. And they would kill him. But David was able to somehow, and we don't see all of the how he did it, but we just know that he was able to keep them together. And so anyway, the folks are distressed. They're crying. They're grieved. Notice that basically they're crying till they can't cry anymore. It's bad. So what do you do? What do you do in a time of disappointment? What do you do in a time of heartache? What do you do in a time of hurt? Well, what does David do? The first thing David does is he finds some people. He calls, first of all, priests, but he wants to be with people. First thing you do is usually the last thing most of us do. When you're distressed, when you're discouraged, when you're down and out, we usually withdraw. We usually withdraw from people. That's just sort of our natural tendency. It's the thought, well, nobody understands, or it's the thought that nobody really cares, or it's the thought that I'm ashamed. There's a lot of different thoughts. And we withdraw, but not David. David finds, if you will, especially the man of God, to help him. He goes in and look in verse 8, David inquired of the Lord. David prayed. When we are discouraged, when we're depressed, when we're upset, we need to pray. We need to find people. We need to pray. David prayed God, prayed for God's help. And of course, David wants a question. What do I do? Do I follow this troop that has invaded my family, taken my family, invaded my space, taken all of my loot and all of my men's loot? What do I do, God? God. And then ultimately, he leans upon the promises of God, because God tells him, go after them. Pursue them. Verse 10. Or, excuse me, they did pursue them in verse 10. 400 men, 200 stayed behind because they were just too tired to move forward. You can imagine. I mean, you've basically done what should have been a 4 days trip. You've done it in 3.5 days, so to speak, give or take. You've once you've gotten to where you're supposed to be, once you've arrived to where you're supposed to be, you've lost everything. The grief that would have set in on them is tremendous. Not only the grief of loss, but also, we've got a bad leader. We need to do something about it. And so you understand why there's 200, you think, why in the world did David take, 400 with him? How in the world these 200 more? Why wasn't it more? But anyway, it was 200. They're so tired they couldn't go. So then, beginning in verse 11, as David continues this process, think about, as we read it, think about the providence of God. And they found an Egyptian in the field, brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate. And they let him drink water, and they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. So when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" And he said, "I'm a young man from Egypt, servant of an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick. We made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites and the territory which belongs to Judah, and of the southern area of Caleb, and we burnt Ziklag with fire." Now think about this. David is beginning to pursue this troop that's gone against him. God has told him, go ahead, you're going to overtake them. And remember, the promise of God was not just that you would overtake them, but notice that he says, verse 8, he says, you'll overtake them without fail, but you'll also get everything back. Now, I'm sure they probably are thinking, we don't see anyone here that was murdered or killed and left here in the camp. But what are we going to find along the way? And what are we going to find when we find them? And how are we going to confront them and not hurt our folks? Because tendencies were in biblical times that when an invading army came in and stole, if you will, the people, that they let the people be their fence, their boundary around them to protect them. And so I'm sure they're thinking about this and how what's David going to do? How are we going to get at them? All of these worries and all of these concerns. And they come across this young man. He's a servant. He says that he is Christian, but he also says that he is a servant of an Amalekite, and he'd fallen sick. And he could not invade. He says, now we've been invading, we've been looting. Notice he talks about the southern area of the Cherethites, which is Philistines, and the territory which belongs to Judah and of the southern area. He's talking about the Philistine area. We've been robbing and looting and invading the Philistines. And he says, I fell sick. Well, notice what they have done, verse 12. They gave him things to eat. They gave him a cake of figs, 2 clusters of raisins. Kind of sounds like a strange diet, but someone suggested that this was probably traveling food. This was food that, you didn't have to worry about warming up. You didn't have to worry about cooking. You didn't have to worry about getting it together. You just ate it. And so sort of like the old Westerns, a lot of us like to watch the old Westerns. When cowboys were hungry, they always pulled out the beef jerky. That was traveling food, right? There was traveling food. But they gave him food to eat. They gave him bread to eat. They gave him water to drink, and because he had not had anything for 3 days. So he's pretty hungry. And David, verse 15 says, can you take me down to this troop? So he said. This young man, ever what his age was, don't know, is got a little moxie about him, a little intelligence. So he said, swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to his troop. Now, there's 2 things here. First of all, there's an oath. And when you study the Old Testament, especially as we've been studying it, you know that, as we've talked about before, when individuals made an oath, they kept their word. I mean, they would die before they would break their word. And so with this young man getting David to swear or to affirm, to swear that he will not hurt him, will take care of him, and he will not deliver him back to the hand of his master, he's protecting himself. Secondly, if you go back to the old law in Deuteronomy 23, one of the things you find out is that once a slave was like that, so to speak, a runaway or set aside by the master, you didn't give him back to the master. There was a fear, evidently, and this is more so assumption than anything. There was fear that the master would abuse the slave. And so consequently, you didn't give him back. But that's what the young man wants. Don't give me back. I'll take it to him, but don't kill me. And so, verse 16, when he had brought him down, there there they were, spread out all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil which had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Then David attacked. And you stop and think about David's faith in what God said. It would have been easy for David to have sat back at the camp and said, woe's me. And sit in his misery and sit in his being upset and question God and wonder why in the world God had forsaken him when he was trying to serve God. But that's not what David did. He inquired of the Lord. The Lord said, go. He went. He trusted. He had faith in God. And so he comes upon this troop. He attacks this troop. Even though they're spread out all over, they're having a big time. It seems as if, notice what it says, they're spread, let's see, this is verse 16, they're spread out all over the land. It's a large group. It's not just one or two, it's a large group. They're having a big party because, oh, look what we've done and look what we've gathered. And David attacked them. Notice that it says, verse 17, from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. Not an unusual thing. Cowboys rode horses. In the Old Testament, of course, they still do it in the New Testament, and even in our day, but in the Old Testament times, warriors sometimes rode on camels. And so you had evidently 400 of those young men who rode on camels. They were able to escape. So David recovered all that the Amalekites carried away, and David rescued his two sons. Now, verse 18, I want you to key on two words that I think are important. The first word is the word all. Notice what it says. David recovered all. It's exactly what God had told him. It's exactly what God had promised to him. He says, you go, you overtake this troop, you'll recover everything. And God gave him everything. But also notice the fact that it took David doing something, if you will. David rescued, there's the second word I want you to key on in this verse, rescued his two wives. David became the hero because he was. And nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that they had taken from them. David recovered all. Then David took all the flocks and the herds they had driven before those other livestock and said, this is David's spoil. So everything was taken back. And we're going home. We've gotten everything. We're going home. So that they did. And David, verse 21, 200 men who had been so weary that they could not follow David, whom they also had made to stay at the brook Besor. So they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. They're anxious to hear. They've gotten their strength back. Exactly how much time elapsed from the time that he left these men at the brook Besor to the time he came back, we have no clue. Now you can say, well, I think it's a week, or I think it was just a few days. You can't affirm that by Scripture. It was long enough that these men evidently had their strength back. They're also now questioning. They're asking, they're probably sitting around saying, where do we go? What do we do next? I wonder what David's doing. We're supposed to stay here. That's what he told us to do. So therefore, that's what we're going to do. But in staying there, they're beginning to talk amongst themselves. And so when they hear of David's coming, they go out. They're anxious to hear what he has to say. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. While they waited David's return, he greets them, and then all the wicked and worthless men. Does somebody's Bible have something different? Troublemakers? Yeah, that's a good way of doing it. I don't know of a version that has this, but literally, it's sons of Belial. The Hebrew is. Which you might say, well, I thought Belial was the devil. Yeah, but it was also used, the Hebrew terms were also used when it talks about the sons of Belial in the Old Testament, that troublemakers, worthless people, good for nothing. But then all the wicked and the worthless men of those who went with David answered and said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for every man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart. Now, here's the thought. They didn't go fight with us. They sat here. They sat here because they too weak. They couldn't muster up enough strength for whatever reason. Some of them probably could have. They could have got off of their seats and moved forward, but they didn't want to. They were still in their grief. We don't want to give them anything. We'll give them back their wives and children, but we're not giving them anything. We don't want them to have anything. Sort of reminds you, in many ways, of how the servant was left behind earlier on in this chapter. They felt pretty much the same way about these men, but David said, and notice David's reply. Notice, first of all, the skillfulness of it. My brethren. A term of endearment, a term of fellowship, a term of family. See how he starts? He doesn't start out, you worthless fellows, you troublemakers, you sorry individuals, you difficult fellows, you soldiers, listen. He doesn't start that way. He starts with, like I say, a term of endearment, a family. My brethren, you shall not do so what the Lord has given us. He says, what we've got is by the Lord's hand and the Lord's strength. It came to us by the Lord, from the Lord, who has preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. God has taken care of us. God has delivered to us. For who will heed you in this matter? In other words, who will listen to you? Who will listen to what you're saying? But as his part is, who goes down to battle, so shall his part be, who stayeth by the supplies. They shall share alike. Now, he lets us in on a little insight that maybe we didn't see before. And that is that evidently, when he left these men at Besor, he left some supplies. There were some things left behind. They couldn't carry everything, or didn't carry everything with them. And he says, we're going to give everybody a little part. We're going to give them back supply. We're going to give them back things. Not just those that went to battle. You know, we sometimes tend to do that. You weren't involved, so you don't get any. I was listening, this has been probably last summer. I was listening or watching Braves baseball game, and I was listening to John Smoltz talk about John Smoltz was a pitcher for the Atlanta Braves, and he was talking about when they won the World Series back in the thank you. I was thinking 92, but that's not right. 95, when they won the World Series. And he was talking about after it was over, I think, matter of fact, the beginning of the next season, they had to divide what's called their shares. In other words, everybody, the team gets so much money, and then it has to be divided out. And they had to decide, who got what. To give this one more. And he talked about it. It was quite interesting. But when I read this, I think about that. But these fellas, okay, who gets what? And so the fellas that went and fight said, we don't want to give them anything. But David says, no, we're not going to be like that. Why? Well, get back to how he began, verse 23. Brethren. We're going to act like brethren. We're going to be like brethren. And we're going to share as we should. There has to be a sense of charitableness about all of this. It's really, if you go back and you read in the book of Numbers, the 31st chapter, this is not the first time this is done. Moses does it in Numbers 31. That there's spoils and everybody gets them, not just the few, but everyone. And so, while not a new concept, David's breaking out. He is showing them something. So it was from that day forward, he made a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. Now, like I say, it was done before, but now basically he's saying this is what we're going to do in this kingdom. We're going to share. Now, when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, here's a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. To those who were in Bethel, those who were in Ramoth of the south, those who were in Jatir, those who were in Aurora, those who were in Sipmoth, those who were in Ethmoa, those who were in Rakel, as some say, those who were in the cities of Cheramelites, those who were in the cities of Kenites. What happened to good old Nashville and Memphis and Jackson and easy names? Those who were in Hormah, those who were in Korashan, those who were in Atha, those who were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to rove. This was sort of this end here, beginning really more in verse 26. Think about when David and his troop took over, they probably didn't just get their stuff back. They got all the other spoils. Remember, the servant said, we've been here and here and here and here, and we've been taking things and invading lands. They've gathered things together. That would have slowed them down. That's one of the reasons, or one of the ways David probably and his men caught them, because they were slowed down by all the spoils that they had. But David and his men gathered it all. They gave them back to the men. All the men now are happy. All of his soldiers that have been with him since Saul started going after him. Remember when David killed Goliath, and Saul then started, if you will, a manhunt against David. All of these soldiers, they now have enough, not just for themselves, but now they're giving back. They're sort of restoring. And the question is kind of asked, is this everywhere that David roamed? Did David not give to some places and give to others? I don't know that we should take this list as being definitive. These were the only places that he gave to. At the same time, it could have been, but it doesn't seem like it would have been. But these were political favors. These were sort of restitution for past losses. This is to show thankfulness for the hospitality that's been given to them and for those who were loyal to Israel. And so David then can really show one thing. And this becomes key because of what happens in the next chapter. And then ultimately, remember the story, as the story goes, the book was not written 1 Samuel and then later 2 Samuel. It was all one book. Men divided it years later. And so as the story goes, what you now see is, remember, David has been anointed as king, but he hasn't taken over. He's a young man. And so now through all of this, David has shown his power, his strength, his courage. David has shown his ability to lead. But also add to that something that maybe is as priceless as any of all of that is the experience, the knowledge that he would have gained from the events themselves and what happened. He's now going to be able to take the lead, to be the king on the throne. And so all of these things sort of work together. Anything else? Well, we can get into the 31st chapter. We can probably finish it. It's short, 13 verses. This is this chapter talks about, it shows gratitude, it shows fidelity or faithfulness, but it also shows a very serious subject. So let's talk about it. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons. The Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Mechuzlah, Saul's son. Battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him with his severely wounded, or excuse me, the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. The arrows, the idea of hit him is interesting. In Hebrews, the idea of they hit him with the arrows. The arrows, literally, the word means the arrows found him. They hit, so he was a target, and they hit their mark. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword, thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through, and abuse me." It's interesting. Saul's ready for somebody to kill him. He's been injured to the degree of injury. It must have been pretty bad. Saul then tells his armor bearer, which is just that. Armor bearers were true servants in biblical times. They did just as the name suggests. They would carry or bear the armor for other soldiers. Saul, of course, would have had an armor bearer being king. Saul has this armor bearer and says, "Draw your sword and kill me." And the reason he says is I don't want these uncircumcised men, these Philistines. I don't want them coming and making sport of me, abusing me. The word abuse is the idea of torture. I don't want them torturing me. I don't want any of this. But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Now, was this fear from the standpoint of afraid that someone might kill him in response? Was this fear for a sense of respect for who Saul was? Was this a fear for just everything that's going on and he's overwhelmed by what's happening? Don't know. Which one is it? Don't know. Is it all of them? Could be. It could be none of those. He's afraid. That's all we've got to understand. He was afraid. He would not. So Saul took the sword and he fell on it. I got to stop here. I got to say something about suicide. I have preached several funerals of those who have taken their lives. One was heavily intoxicated. I know that. One or two were depressed. Other reasons. When you think about it in the Bible talks here about Saul, and the armor bearer, actually, we didn't get to it, also takes his life. Ahithophel in 2 Samuel will take his life. Zimri in 1 Kings will take his life. And Judas, of course, in Matthew 27 will take his life. That's the only cases I am aware of suicide in the Bible. For one to take his own life violates the will of God, but yet at the same time, too, you have to ask, were they in their right mind? I'm not the judge, and I can't be the judge. And I'm not going to be the judge. I'm going to let God take care of that. I do know that like I say, suicide breaks the laws of God. They don't kill. It also breaks the if you will, really, God, you're not the one in charge of my body. I am. And moves God out of the picture, pushes God aside. It is really selfish in a lot of ways. But there's also mitigating circumstances when someone takes their life. And it's very hard to understand. And it's very hard to wrap our mind around. What do? You love the family that's left behind. You weep with them. You cry with them. You love them. You love them dearly. Probably even if there's a note left, you'll never really know all the answers this side of eternity. And on the other side, it won't matter. More than likely, like I said, there's something amiss there, because the Bible even tells us, no man ever yet hated himself, but loves, nourishes, cherishes himself. Back 4 years ago, I was called and told an individual young man, a kid actually, in between his junior and senior year of high school, and he had gone in his room and he'd hung himself, and knew his family very well, all sides of the family very well, and you don't know. But I say that to say this: I've talked on several occasions about mental health. Mental health is important. And we need to be sure that we're in tune to everybody that's around us. And when they begin to give away things, they begin to talk about final things, they begin to act abnormal, those are telltale signs. And the things that you can do is question them and plead with them to go get help. That you'll even go with them, you'll take them. And to make sure that they get that help. Don't ever get to that point, and it's interesting. Do you know who commits the most suicide percentages? Our age. Our age. Don't do it. That sounds maybe a little coarse, but don't do it because I love you. Don't do it because people love you. Don't do it because you're of value. You're of worth. You're important. Find help. Seek that help out. Saul's want, if you will, was a little different. But his armor bearer was afraid, and therefore Saul took a sword, fell on it. Armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, so he also fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all of his men died together that same day. Probably, when it says all his men right there in the verse 6, is probably not as we would think of all of his men. And the reason I say that is because when you get into 2 Samuel chapter 2, 1 and 2, we find out that there are some left. So all was more of just, how we use it kind of accommodatively, but it doesn't mean everybody. It's sort of like, I've told you the story about a man that came into the elders meeting one time and says, well, everybody in the congregation's upset about so-and-so. And so another elder said, well, let's who are these people? Let's find them. And so in a congregation of 500 people, there were 4 that this group can only name. So that's not everybody. Well, we think in terms of that. We use those terms. And so when it says all here, it's probably not, don't take it as a literal standpoint because of what is said later on in 2 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. Now, when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those who were on the other side of the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. When you fall, we've often talked about, especially in this book, hand-to-hand combat. Not always was it full army against full army. Sometimes it was just a few against a few. And the rest of the army would watch. Nevertheless, what you did, especially the conquering side, would go out the next day over the battlefield. Well, there would be soldiers, there would be armor, there would be swords. There would also be the fact that you can, cut their head off and take their head or part of their body. That was sort of the trophy, but it was also identification. We hear that every once in a while. The military does that now, especially with some of the folks that they kill, some of the Taliban and others. But nevertheless, they stripped the slain. They found Saul, his 3 sons, had fallen at Mount Gilboa. They cut off their heads, stripped off their armor, sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols and among the people. Probably the temple there is Dagon's temple. Remember, we've talked about Dagon, the god here of the Philistines. And so they took their heads and they nailed them to the wall. They nailed them to the wall in the temple. And it says they put his armor on the temple in Ashtaroth of the Ashtaroths. And they fastened his body to the wall at Bethshan. So this was This was their trophy. This was to symbolize their victory. The reality of it is that this was not so much a victory for the God of Dagon. It was not so much because of the weakness of God that they had won, but it was because of some bad decisions that were made and not following God, especially in the leaders of Israel, that they lost. Now, when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose, traveled all night, took the body of Saul and the bodies of his son from the wall of Bethshan. And they came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So the tamarisk tree could be a sort of a landmark. My brother-in-law farmed. He did a lot of different things. He farmed, but he also appraised property, had a business of appraising property. And when he first started, we were talking about it, and he's talking about how that some of these old deeds would have it begins in the northeast corner by the oak tree. And, that oak tree was gone many years ago. And so you had to figure all of that out as he appraised property. But the tamarisk tree probably that they're talking about was a particular landmark. They remembered Saul. They took care of Saul. They took his bones and they buried him there. And then they fasted. They grieved. They gave him the honor that they felt he was due, not being shown as a trophy in a false god's temple, but being the soldier and the leader of Israel. They felt that they had to do him some service, and so they did. And so they treated him with kindness and respect. Anything else? That ends 1 Samuel. Well, it's a great, great book, and I hope you've studied it. And here will probably be the first of next year, but we're going to talk about a sermon. And it asks this question: are all scriptures profitable? Because we look at what am I supposed to get out of this? It's a story. Well, just hang on, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. We'll talk about a lot of things in that sermon, but a little bit about how all this fits together. What we're going to study, what I'm going to study, I know the ladies are ready to come out. What I'm planning on studying, so if you want to raise an objection, and that's fine. But I would like to study for the next several weeks the prayers of Jesus. Some of them are just a verse or two, some of them quite long. But I'd like to study those and see what we can learn from them. I do a lot of study on prayers because I want to make sure my prayer life's where it should be. And it just helps me. But if you're not ready for that, we can do something else. I've got several other topics I can take you through that's got a lot of lessons to them. As we develop them, we'll develop and see. But that's kind of what I'd like to do next. And that'll take us a little while. And anyway, any questions, comments, suggestions, thoughts? Remember, folks, that Jay mentioned a while ago. And let's bow for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, the opportunity that we have. We're thankful for your word and what it means to us, and for the fact that it is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. We ask that you watch over us, bless us, be those that were mentioned in our announcements. We ask that those who are going through difficult times, that you be with them, those that are hurting, those families that are hurting due to the loss of a loved one, that you bless them with strength and comfort, and that you wrap your loving arms around them and give them that they need, as we know that you will. We ask that you watch over us as we go throughout the rest of this week, that we will live and be the Christian example that we should be, the light to a world of darkness that needs that light. Bless us and hold us. We hold to you, for this is our prayer. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.